the podcast on the question, Has Liberal Asian Studies Failed Politically? Part 3, the question of fundamentals, fundamental assumptions that a Westerner brings to the understanding of, for example, in this case, Japan. And that fundamental assumption is this: a Japanese is a person, not a category. A person. My equivalent in every sense that matters, in a few cultural distinctions of great importance, but fundamentally, the Japanese I meet, talk with, do any number of things with, is a person and not a category. Now, that may seem like a truism, but let me elaborate a bit. When I was a student in Japan, as a reference I've made elsewhere to the brilliant planning and research of the University of California to find International Christian University as its Japanese study center, because that turned out to be an absolute dream ticket. And one of the reasons is a subtle thing, which I will explain, and that is the fact that the gakubu, the faculty, the organization collectively of the research community and teaching community as a whole, was singular. One faculty to which all students belonged. There was no international division in which foreigners were confined for Japanese language purposes or any other. We were in with the Japanese. They were our fellow students. They were our classmates. They are the people we lived in the dormitories with. Now, this is transformative. I mean, on reflection, at the time I arrived, I just took it in stride. But on reflection, this built connections with Japanese society which have no rival. I have a better connection with some of my Japanese classmates than any person they have worked with subsequently, any Japanese they have worked with subsequently. So I've got an insider-outsider relationship with a great number of these people. Now, that's not the point fundamentally. And this, we'll come to an explanation of why this is, but fundamentally, when you meet a Japanese, it's as an individual, but not necessarily an Anglo-American individual, a group-minded individual because he's Japanese, but he's a person. He has an individual history. He has a precise stamp, a manner of speaking, a take on things, which is unique to him or her. And so the process of getting to know them is to know these unique qualities, which make that person, and not a category. He may be, or she may be, very Japanese, as we say, but in the first instance, it doesn't matter, because to me, he's a person. Now, again, this may seem abstract, but let me elaborate. For a considerable period of the time, the dormitory I was in Japan, I was the only white person. And the other minority in the dormitory were Hong Kong Chinese. And this was invaluable because Hong Kong Chinese are good English speakers. And in the beginning, my Japanese wasn't up to it. So although some of the Japanese spoke very good English, nevertheless, the Chinese, because they were foreigners, could explain things to me that I wouldn't, for the Japanese, took for granted. And they're also really good at making food, and I'm a foodie, so the Hong Kong Chinese won my heart really early. But you see the same approach. The Hong Kong Chinese, I'm talking as a group, but in my mind, there are individuals, there were 4 of them, 1 for each year, and they had names and personal characteristics and completely contrasting personalities in some cases. One was a food academic, very research-minded. Another was a martial artist. And you see what I'm getting at. But the idea that these people were different from me, in essence, was impossible for me to imagine. I mean, now, my suspicion on reflection, today is the day of reflection. After all this has happened, years and years and years ago, I talked with a friend in Tokyo, an American who came after me and lived in the dormitory next to mine at ICU, an ICU graduate like I am, white American who has excellent Japanese, lived in Japan forever and ever. And we were talking about this. Now, his approach and my approach are very similar. It's difficult to frame it, but the Japanese are real to me. And I'm not always convinced of my academic colleagues that the Japanese were real in that sense. I mean, even married couples, often the man being white and the wife being Japanese, the reverse happens, but it's comparatively rare. Their wives were real, but they did bleed over into Japan being real. Japan was out there, and my Japan was not out there. At some point, when I at my most intense identification with being Japanese, although I could never be Japanese, but I felt very, very attracted. I mean, I spent all day in Japanese. I dreamed in Japanese. My community and all the people I talked with all day long were Japanese. And so I had a Japanese name. I mean, the whole bit. But that was me making an effort. But the fundamental point of departure was different. Where I got to the end of the diving board and plunged into the Japanese sea, it was to be with them, among them, as my equals, as human beings. This is not an ethical perception. This is a reality perception. This is, now, the question is, okay, to make this a little clearer, where does this come from and where does it not come from? Now, in the approaches among Orientalism, to take a classical, if contested view of a method of Western understanding of the Orient, the Occident, the Orient, hence the West, East. The outstanding school as a collective for understanding Japan, or China as China, or enlist the rest, was what I call the Southern Celtic school of Orientalism, the Welsh and the Bretons in France. We are unrivaledly good at this. We really get to it. And reasons for that are complicated and take some thinking about. But until today, I didn't really think about it this way, that the reason I got on with all those people in the dormitory, if you wanted to put it in categorical terms, which sounds contradictory, but if you wanted to put it in categorical terms, is because I'm Welsh. And I take people as they are. My first impulse when walking into a room is, who can I be superior to? That doesn't occur to me. It simply does not occur. I'm in a room with people, I will say, who's here? Let's find out about them. Now, a subtext of this, and it relates to the Celtic tradition as a whole, and this goes back to something that any couple will understand, is that how good is my other half at listening to me? Now, in my experience, again, being an heir of an ancient oral culture, we really take listening seriously. I mean, we talk all the time, but we take interest in listening seriously. And there's a story I've told in other contexts, but I'll mention here just to make the point. I had a personal trainer for a while, for reasons I won't go on to here, an Irishman. And he was brilliant, but that wasn't the point here. The point is, one day I wandered at the gym where he did his stuff, and gyms organized along alleyways, machinery. And I walked back and I looked down, and there was my friend talking to, I assume, one of his clients. And I waved. He didn't wave back. And later I asked him, I said, did you not see me? Oh, no, I didn't see you. I was talking to her. And then I formulated something which struck me as true of my experience, is that when someone opens their mouth in my presence, especially in a one-on-one circumstance, they become the whole world. They are the total focus of my interest. And that leads to, for example, memorizing detail, paying attention to facial expressions, the reality of the conversation. I mean, your heads bend together. And this approach, this reality of the other person, someone not worth listening to, because anybody's worth listening to, because they all have something to say. We all have a story to tell. And the story, of course, is one of the points. With an oral tradition, oral traditions are storytelling traditions, and you exchange stories. But the idea of talking and listening freely with total concentration is the thing. And you can imagine, as a research tool, as a research approach, how potent this is. Because when I sit down with a Japanese, he's the whole world. And from that whole world experience, there are so many things to learn. Furthermore, without that approach, there are so many things not learned. And that's what I'm talking about when we try to trace the sources of the failure of liberal Asian studies politically is, in some sense, it's a failure of liberal nation studies methodologically, or philosophically, or in the realm of the person. And that's another point. It has to be drilled home, because I think on this subject, the Wales Breton approach is superior to all its rivals, and these lessons need to have a larger resonance in our community as a whole. You don't have to be Welsh or Breton to be able to do this, but you may have to work at it. And that's what we're working on. Part 3 ends there.